The Concord Assembly Chamber had been built for spectacle long before it had been built for justice, and on emergency days it looked like a theater, pretending to be a court. Tiered galleries climbed into shadow beneath a vaulted membrane of glass and alloy where starlight filtered through dust from 100 trade routes. Holographic banners floated above each delegation dais, translated into local spectrums, while drones circled in disciplined loops, recording every syllable for legal archive and public stream. At the center platform, the Nexari delegation stood without seats. They preferred it that way. Standing made their height part of the argument. High Commander Blake wore no insignia other than a matte crown circuit around his cranial ridge, the symbol of cognition rank among the psychic castes. The Nexari body plan was lean and predatory, articulated in smooth armor-black skin, marked by faint silver neural lines that pulsed whenever they broadcast. Their species had climbed from one world to 9 sectors by mastering telepathic coercion as both doctrine and commerce. Their fleets won wars quickly because they rarely had to finish them. Most opponents collapsed once command crews began seeing nightmares in awake daylight and hearing confidence turn into panic in their own skulls. For generations, that pattern had passed for natural law. Blake tilted his head toward the human dais and smiled with ceremonial contempt. "Honored delegates," he began, his voice amplified by chamber acoustics into a velvet blade, "we gather because Earth has again confused sentiment with governance. They shelter Thalan populations under an antique compact drafted in the infancy of interstellar law. A curious arrangement, yes, between frightened juveniles. But history is not immunity, and pity is not sovereignty." The Nexari mind band brightened. Several delegates flinched as Blake pushed a light telepathic pulse through the room, enough to establish dominance, not enough to violate chamber restraint protocols on paper. "Humans remain a mute species," he said, each word paced for translation lag so no one missed the insult. "Their minds are sealed caves. They cannot share thought, cannot audit intent in real time, cannot weaponize consciousness. Politically primitive, strategically transparent, biologically temporary." A low murmur moved around the circular hall. Some species watched the humans, others watched the exits. Blake raised one hand and a projection snapped to life above the center ring. 3 human diplomats appeared in captured memory format, their emotional bands extracted by Nexari interrogators and rendered as color-washed overlays. Fear spikes, pain, anger, restraint. The display reduced private human reactions to entertainment graphics. Nexari aides did not bother to hide their amusement as they magnified a single heartbeat surge and looped it. "This," Blake said, gesturing to the floating humiliation, "is why we are here. Creatures who cannot govern their own emotional weather claim guardianship over a vulnerable refugee species. We are extending protective stewardship over the Thalan for humanitarian continuity. Transfer custody within 1 standard day. Nexari convoy marshals will assume relocation authority, and Earth will refrain from symbolic interference." Thalan delegate Siren of Low Tide straightened all 4 shoulders and spoke through a trembling throat sac. Protective stewardship was the phrase used before the Cinder deportations on Riavel. Blake did not look at the Thalan. Riavel lacked compliance. The chamber cooled by 2 degrees as emergency climate systems compensated for rising species-specific stress markers. By the 3rd hour of emergency session, every neutral block had already received 3 private Nexari memoranda warning of secondary instability if the transfer was obstructed. Blake continued, louder now, grand enough for the record. "Let the assembly observe my clarity. Any polity that cannot read thought lives in permanent deception. Such a polity cannot sustain mature treaty obligations. Earth's so-called covenant with the Thalen is invalid under current security doctrine, and I will not have my officers negotiating with emotional guesswork. You do not place evacuation corridors in the custody of children and call it ethics. He turned fully toward the human dais at last. Relinquish the refugees. Yield all Thalen corridor beacons for Nexari calibration. Submit your convoy schedules for harmonization. Resist, and we will conduct a stabilization campaign. You may keep your speeches. We will keep the living. No one in the chamber asked which living. Ambassador Elena Volkov sat very still while the projection of her colleagues' extracted fear rotated above the floor like a trophy. She was not old, but long diplomatic years had carved precision into every movement. Her uniform was civilian charcoal, with a narrow earth crest at the collar, no ceremonial braid, no jewelry, no theatrical rank markers. Behind her chair, 2 empty places carried the names of envoys still missing after convoy seizure operations in Thalen corridors. On her private channel, muted to chamber feed, Fleet Admiral Marcus Hayes appeared from Earth Joint Command. His image was monochrome due to hardline encryption, his expression unreadable, except for the way he held his jaw. He is setting legal theater for unilateral boarding authority, Hayes said. We have confirmation on 6 abducted convoy crews. Not dead. Relocated. Volkov kept her gaze on Blake. Locations? Fragmentary. 2 likely in Nexari relay custody. 4 moved between carriers. They are treating people as leverage and telemetry bait. A second channel opened with Captain Sofia Novak from Mission Security Detail, stationed 3 decks below the assembly hall. Novak spoke in clipped cadence shaped by boarding doctrine and courtroom patience. Ambassador Outer Concourse sweep complete. No physical interference vectors. Psychological provocation remains primary threat. If he escalates projection abuse, I request formal procedural challenge. Denied for now, Volkov said. He wants us reactive. Novak gave a single nod. Understood. Teams remain in place. The Thalen observers at the rear of the human gallery had no talent for masking fear. Their species had evolved under shallow seas and low-gravity archipelagos with translucent neck membranes that flushed dark when stressed. Several were dark already. 50 years earlier, before Earth had voting rights in this chamber, those same membranes had darkened on evacuation decks while 6 remaining Thalen colonies negotiated for food routes and anti-piracy escort. Many major powers offered terms that looked like rescue and read like ownership. Earth, still poor by conquered standards and barely post-expansion, had offered ships, grain algae patents, and defense volunteers without demanding labor concessions or debt chains. The Earth-Thalen Covenant had been signed in a rain-soaked hall in Reykjavik with 40 witnesses and 1 faulty heater. 3 centuries later, the Nexari called it sentimental paperwork. Volkov touched the treaty pin hidden inside her left sleeve, an old habit she never discussed publicly. Then she rose. The chamber registered human standing posture and shifted camera focus automatically. Across the upper tiers, delegates leaned in. The Nexari believed telepathy ended surprises. That belief had kept them in power for a long time. Volkov did not raise her voice. The translators overcorrected at first, then settled into a flatter register as if uncertain where to place threat inside so calm a tone. "Hi, Commander Blake," she said. "The Concord record will preserve your request exactly as spoken. It will also preserve this response. The Earth-Thalen Covenant is active law, continuously honored for 312 standard years through famine cycles, piracy wars, market embargoes, and sovereign transition on both sides. Thalen citizens are not transferable property. Any attempt to seize them will be treated as a direct attack on Earth. Silence spread outward in rings. She continued, each clause measured for legal precision. You currently occupy Thalan corridors with armed vessels. You currently hold abducted convoy crews. You currently interfere with recognized asylum traffic. Withdraw your fleets from those corridors, release all detained personnel, and submit to neutral arbitration within 1 standard day. Blake laughed, and this time he did not bother to mute his telepathic broadcast. A wave of contempt swept the nearest tiers like static over skin. Non-psychic theater, he said. You have delivered a warning with no mind behind it. Patience, Ambassador, is only another word for species-level fear. He spread his hands to the chamber as if presenting a solved equation. When your captains feel what my pilots can send into them, they will fracture. When your logisticians wake screaming, your supply webs will knot themselves. When your refugees witness your weakness, they will beg for proper custodianship. You cannot hide intention from those born to read it. You cannot outmaneuver a civilization that hears command before command is spoken. Hayes spoke softly in Volkov's ear channel, unheard by the chamber. We have heard versions of that forecast for 30 years. Volkov answered without moving her lips. Status on preparations. Cognitive hardening complete across forward crews. Autonomous intent packages loaded. Treaty web beacons synced with Thalan microjump lattice. Silent choir in standby pending your authorization. The phrase hung between them like a blade still sheathed. From the concourse channel, Novak added, boarding groups briefed for countercast detainment if escalation crosses force threshold. We trained for live psychic pressure. Morale steady. Volkov let Blake finish basking in his own certainty. Around the chamber, neutral observers traded private packets. The merchants of Pax had gone motionless, antennae folded tight. The avians of Kith whispered among themselves in rapid clicks. Even species long irritated by human legalism seemed less amused now than attentive. Because beneath Blake's performance, the numbers were obvious to anyone reading logistics instead of ego. The Nexari had massed fleets inside refugee corridors and called it guardianship. They had seized civilian crews and called it security harmonization. They had mocked the oldest treaty in known space in full assembly stream. That was not confidence. It was commitment. Volkov inclined her head exactly 1 degree. Diplomatic courtesy offered to an opponent who had just crossed every line she needed him to cross in public. Then we understand each other, she said. When she sat, Hayes exhaled for what might have been the first time in 10 minutes. Novak transmitted a clean status burst and began moving her teams toward extraction routes. The Thalan delegate closed all 4 eyes in exhausted relief that looked almost like grief. Overhead, the projection of captured human fear finally timed out and vanished. What remained in the chamber was quieter and far more dangerous. An ultimatum on record, a deadline ticking in every command center from Earth to Keelid Gate, and a species long dismissed as mentally blind preparing to demonstrate that discipline did not require telepathy, only memory. The chamber did not erupt when session lock released. It exhaled. Delegations dissolved into tightly choreographed clusters, each species performing its version of composure while dispatching emergency packets to capitals that had already started wargaming the deadline. Volkov remained seated long enough to watch Blake step down from the central platform without once looking toward the Thalan dais. The gesture was deliberate. In Nexari protocol, eye contact acknowledged peer status. He denied it to everyone except cameras. By the time Volkov entered the human secure transit tube, Hayes had opened a full-spectrum command channel and invited exactly 3 civilian witnesses from Concord legal staff, which meant he expected the next exchange to become evidence. He will act before the day expires, Hayes said, voice clipped by encryption latency. Not because he needs tactical advantage, because he needs narrative ownership. If he can make us fire first in public feed, some neutral blocks will hide behind procedure. Volkov unpinned the treaty marker inside her sleeve and set it on the console in front of her. The tiny silver disc had survived 3 redesigns of Earth diplomatic uniform and a flood in the Reykjavik archive vault. Then, we give him no ambiguity, she said. Open priority channel to Nexari Command and copy every neutral monitor that still pretends this is an internal dispute. Blake answered from a moving command deck, black armor reflecting tactical glyphs. He did not bow. "Ambassador," he said, "you requested immediate link. I admire your efficiency at the edge of surrender." Volkov spoke with formal pacing, each sentence built to survive hostile translation. "High Commander Blake, this is Earth Final Notice reaffirmed. You are currently in material breach of asylum law and covenant protections, recognized by Concord Charter Annex 17. Withdraw armed vessels from Thalon civilian corridors, release all detained crews, and submit vessel registries for neutral inspection within the remaining treaty interval. If you cross seizure threshold against protected traffic, Earth will treat it as active aggression." Blake's smile widened with clinical patience, as if explaining gravity to a child who disliked falling. "Your species continues to confuse sound with force. You call yourself disciplined because you hide thought from one another behind meat and bone and chemical storms. We call that handicap. The Thalon are a declining dependency trapped in your nostalgia. We will remove them from your custody and stabilize the route architecture you have mismanaged for centuries. You may resist if symbolism soothes you. When our cognition fleets touch your command crews, your officers will drown in their own unedited terror, your captains will misread every vector, and your refugees will seek competent guardians. This is not threat language, it is forecast." He terminated the channel before protocol allowed right of reply. Hayes leaned back in his command chair on the monochrome feed, eyes fixed somewhere beyond Volkov, where operational maps lived. "Forecast received," he said. "Concord Legal confirms admissibility. Every neutral feed saw it." Captain Novak appeared on a side pane from assembly sub-level security, helmet mag-clipped at her hip, posture resting on contained momentum. "Ambassador, Nexari internal traffic just spiked across 3 convoy intercept groups. They are moving before deadline. Request authority to relocate Thalon delegates to harden transit now." "Granted," Volkov said. "No heroics in the corridors. Keep it procedural and visible." Novak gave the smallest trace of dry humor. "Visible procedure has become our national specialty." 17 standard hours into the deadline, a Thalon medical convoy under Earth registry transmitted a seizure alarm from the Isker Bend. The call lasted 14 seconds before Nexari jamming flattened it into static. The convoy had carried dialysis cultures, pressure lung kits, and 200 displaced families from ring habitats damaged in prior raids. Nexari Marshal Craft attached magnetic clamps to civilian hulls and declared protective reassignment under emergency stewardship doctrine that existed only in Nexari law. A human escort corvette, too light to challenge 3 Nexari cutters, requested arbitration code clearance and received a targeting lock in response. Volkov listened to the recording once, then again. On the second playback, she focused on the background sounds. Not screams, not panic, but crew callouts following checklist order while interference built. People who had trained for this exact moment had sounded afraid and functional at the same time. The crux was no longer whether Blake intended coercion. The crux was whether any government in the chamber would still pretend to misunderstand it. At deadline -3 hours, Volkov returned to the assembly floor for a legally required reconciliation window that no one believed in. Blake arrived late by 9 minutes and stood with ceremonial calm, while the clerk recited violations into record. When invited to respond, he offered a speech too polished to be improvised. For 140 years, the Nexari have maintained navigational sanity in sectors where lesser powers turned refugee flow into piracy markets. We read intent because intent kills before weapons fire does. We govern thought because undisciplined thought births war. Humanity has cloaked itself in antique language and called it virtue, yet it cannot perform the most basic duty of modern statecraft, which is cognition transparency among command actors. You ask us to trust blind captains with vulnerable populations, while you hide military buildup behind treaty nostalgia. We decline. At interval close, we will assume stewardship by necessity. Any interference will be corrected. The avian delegate from Kith broke neutrality long enough to ask, "Corrected by what legal standard?" Blake answered without turning his head. "By surviving one." At 1 minute past deadline, Hayes transmitted a single line to Volkov on the private channel they had used all day. Authority transferred. Volkov signed the response packet with biometric seal, voice print, and treaty code older than either of their careers. Earth Joint Command is authorized to execute defensive continuity operations, she said. Objective set is corridor restoration, personnel recovery and civilian protection. Minimum necessary force. Full evidence chain. Hayes acknowledged, then spoke to fleet channels spanning 3 systems. All commands, this is Joint. Execute continuity phase 1. Maintain rule set Aster. Recover our people. Hold the lanes. When Volkov looked up, Blake was already walking out of the chamber. Oriel Junction had never been a beautiful place, but it was useful in the way arteries were useful. 6 micro-jump corridors braided through a gravity-stable volume, dense with relay buoys, fuel tenders, and cargo platforms old enough to have names painted by hand in 3 alphabets. Nexari doctrine selected it for the opening blow because utility targets forced moral concessions. You could defend warships and lose civilians, or defend civilians and lose command coherence. Most governments chose wrong under pressure. Substrategist Kel Vran of the Nexari operations. Spindle watched the tactical sphere bloom with human signatures and felt professional satisfaction sharpen into anticipation. Human formation discipline looked tidy, almost ceremonial. 2 carrier groups, escort screens, Thalen evacuation clusters tucked behind logistics holes with insufficient armor. Predictable. He initiated phase veil and pushed psychic waveform arrays through aligned amplifiers. Across open channels, Nexari cognition pilots projected fear architectures calibrated from captured human emotional scans. Drowning dreams for life support crews, vertigo disorientation for gunnery officers, grief loops for command staff. Previous opponents had fractured within 90 seconds. On his display, human biofeedback did spike. Cortisol analog estimates climbed. Heart rhythms scattered. Several vessels drifted a few degrees off plotted lanes. "Collapse index?" Fran asked. "Partial," replied the analyzer cast officer, confusion flattening his tone. "They are degraded, not broken." Vran narrowed his eyes and increased intensity 2 points above doctrine. "Again." Nexari strike wings surged forward under cover of their own psychic haze. Precision beams lanced at orbital logistics nodes, aiming to strip fuel and food transfer capacity before heavy hull combat began. 2 human depot rings ruptured and vented cargo modules in glittering trails. A Thalen tug split under concentrated fire, emergency pods ejecting in disciplined clusters. On neutral observer feeds, it looked exactly like the opening script Blake had promised. Humans absorbing punishment, evacuation lanes buckling, Nexari cutters advancing with predatory confidence. Then human command traffic went quiet by design. not panic. Vran expected calm blackout to signal paralysis. Instead, every major human hull executed pre-briefed vector changes within a 5-second tolerance window, even ships that had just taken damage. No central flagship transmitted course authority. Captains acted on intent packages loaded before contact, branching through contingencies as if each had rehearsed the whole battle privately. Nexari cognition readers pushed harder, searching for command mines to disrupt, and found only layered noise, fragments, decoys, and a stubborn baseline of disciplined fear that refused to convert into chaos. "Where is their coordinating thought?" one Nexari officer demanded. Vran answered with irritation he did not feel in full yet. "In fragments, distributed. Primitive redundancy." But the redundancy kept working. Human escort destroyers rolled broadside and launched rail lance salvos at Nexari interdiction ships attacking evacuation lanes. The first volley missed by margins that would have embarrassed Academy cadets. The second walked closer. The third stripped shield harmonics from a cutter and drove it tumbling out of lane control. Thalon micro-jump beacons, previously tagged as civilian navigation aids, lit in sequence across the junction like a net tightening. Reinforcement transponders appeared where no mass-capable fleet should have reached so quickly. Vran stared as 4 human modular carriers translated into firing geometry from vectors his planners had labeled low probability for 20-minute windows. "They cannot be there," the analyzer cast officer said. "Update your probabilities," Vran replied, and felt the first clean edge of concern. On the human flagship Resolute Meridian, Hayes watched the same tactical sphere with the stillness of someone who had rehearsed catastrophe, often enough to distrust adrenaline. "Cognitive hardening reports," he asked. "Functional degradation across all crews," operations answered. "Average performance drop 13% under pulse load. No strategic fragmentation. Autonomous trees holding. Evacuation corridors. Thalon Lane 3 reopened. Lane 2 contested, stabilizing." Hayes keyed direct to escort commands without raising volume. "Do not chase kills. Keep the lanes alive. Strike command relays when windows open. If they offer you bait, leave it." A lieutenant at Sensors hesitated, then said, "Admiral, we are seeing additional Nexari biosignatures that do not map to hull count. Could be boarding pods. Could be projection artifacts." Hayes allowed himself one narrow breath of grim irony. "If our guests brought ghosts, we will bill them for cargo space. Mark all uncertain signatures for silent choir filters." He did not authorize the full protocol. Not yet. But the phrase moved through command channels and crews straightened at their stations as if someone had unlocked a muscle memory they had waited years to use. Back in the Nexari spindle, Vran watched his confidence degrade by increments too small to admit and too large to ignore. Human ships still bled atmosphere in places. 2 escorts were dead in the water. Several Thalon transports had been forced off primary routes. By raw tonnage, Nexari retained advantage. By doctrine tempo, something had gone wrong. Every time cognition pilots concentrated on one human command cluster, another acted with unnerving independence. Every time Nexari strike craft isolated a convoy, fresh escorts appeared through beacon hops that should have required impossible logistics timing. Across public channels, Blake released a triumph bulletin declaring Oriel under managed Nexari control. Vran let it run because politics required momentum. Then, he opened a private military band to Fleet Command and spoke with precise restraint. "Human resistance capacity exceeds pre-contact models. Their fear response is present, but tactically contained. Recommend immediate expansion from demonstration strike to full suppression package before they adapt further." The reply came from Blake himself, cool with offended certainty. You are witnessing terminal flutter. Continue current plan. They cannot sustain this. Vran acknowledged and closed the channel. Outside his viewport, human and Nexari ships wheeled through the subjunction in tightening spirals around civilian lanes that refused to collapse on schedule. He had spent his career believing that mines could be mastered first and battles second. At Oriole, for the first time, he suspected the order might reverse, and that suspicion was dangerous enough to hide. On Earth, CommandNet, Hayes read the latest casualty updates, looked once at the list of abducted crews still unaccounted for, and gave the next order. Phase 1 holds. Initiate Phase 2 shaping operations. We warned them in open chamber. Now we teach them what that warning meant. Phase 2. Shaping acknowledged, Captain Renault said from Tactical, and the response cascaded through the human defense net in clipped confirmations that sounded almost mundane against the violence outside the hull. On Resolute Meridian, no one shouted. The bridge operated at a deliberate tempo that had been rehearsed in simulators designed to be cruel in very specific ways. Every officer wore a thin haptic band at the wrist, pulsing a steady metronome independent of ship systems, a tactile anchor for cognition drills when telepathic interference turned perception unreliable. Fear metrics spiked across every deck. Procedure compliance remained above 90%. Hayes kept his eyes on the layered plot where civilian lanes, enemy vectors, and beacon corridors braided into one unforgiving geometry. Signal all convoy escorts, he said. Shift from reaction arcs to corridor denial. We are no longer proving we can endure. We are proving they cannot predict what endurance looks like. The order moved. Destroyers that had spent the opening exchange screening transports broke into paired elements and began short-burst acceleration patterns that made little doctrinal sense from a Nexari perspective. Human ships accepted temporary positional disadvantage to force Nexari pursuit into pre-marked zones where gravitic turbulence and debris shear degraded targeting confidence. The move was subtle enough to look like retreat unless you tracked it over 3 full minutes. 9 minutes into Phase 2, the first deliberate demonstration occurred. The frigate Kirov line took a direct psychic pulse that should have snapped command continuity. Nexari cognition pilots layered drowning panic over confinement terror, then injected grief imagery harvested from captured emotional scans. The bridge crew went pale under console light. 2 officers vomited into emergency bags and kept working. The executive officer lost visual depth perception for 12 seconds, announced it calmly, and switched to instrument-only gunnery cues. Their captain, Commander Imani Sato, pressed both palms to the edge of her station until her knuckles blanched, listened to the metronome at her wrist, and spoke into internal comm with textbook cadence. Crew of Kirov line, this is command. Symptoms are expected. Name 1 verified input before every action. If your thoughts are loud, your checklist is louder. Helm, execute branch Delta 4. Weapons, fire by timer, not instinct. We are still here. Her voice reached nearby escorts on open coordination band. It was not inspirational speech. It was process. That was the point. Kirov line rolled through incoming fire, venting a ribbon of atmosphere from a midsection hit, and delivered a rail lance sequence at a Nexari interdiction cutter that had lined up on a Thalon hospital transport. First shot stripped shielding. Second shattered maneuver vanes. Third punched through the cutter's drive collar and sent it spinning clear of lane traffic. The hospital transport survived with scorched plating and all life support modules intact. On Nexari monitors, the event registered as doctrinal contradiction. Kel Vran watched biometric overlays from 6 human hulls and felt irritation harden into unease. His analysts had always taught that fear was a lever with predictable mechanics. Increase pressure, reduce coherence, then break command. The human pattern refused the terminal step. Their stress signatures looked catastrophic. Their fleet behavior looked coordinated. He replayed Kirov Line's telemetry, isolating command latency, aiming error, and correction loops. The numbers were ugly and effective in equal measure. "They are fighting while impaired," said analyst Sal, disbelief flattening her normally precise diction. "They fought while impaired at first contact," Fran said. Sal's fingers hovered over her console, silver neural lines bright with strain. "No, this is different. They are integrating the impairment. Their actions are routed through pre-committed intent trees. If we inject panic, they do not seek clarity. They seek procedure. The fear remains, but the decision architecture does not depend on emotional stability." Vran hated the elegance of that sentence because it sounded like respect. At the edge of Oriel's western corridor, 2 Thalen evacuation clusters attempted microjumps through beacon chains under escort by the carrier Dauntless River and 3 corvettes. Nexari strike wings dove to sever the chain between beacons 7 and 8, the exact breakpoint that would strand civilian hulls in open drift. Human comm discipline stayed sparse, almost austere. No pleading, no improvisational chatter, just vector calls, damage reports, and branch codes. Then the treaty web showed its second layer through the first capability. Thalen microbeacons, dismissed for decades as refugee infrastructure, shifted frequency in a pattern only Earth and Thalen navigators had rehearsed together. Human modular carriers waiting 2 systems away translated into Oriel, not in one dramatic jump, but in staggered pulses, synchronized to beacon flicker intervals. To Nexari sensors, they appeared like reinforcements materializing from statistical noise. To human planners, they were simply on time. "Reinforcement marker count just tripled," operations reported on Resolute Meridian. Hayes nodded once. "They did not triple. They arrived when we promised." A Nexari destroyer pivoted to intercept the new arrivals and exposed its command relay spine to protect its ventral batteries. Human gunners would not normally have had a clean angle through drifting cargo shells and shattered station struts. Under psychic pressure, they had no business threading it. They fired anyway, by timer and pre-computed offset, and clipped the relay spine hard enough to blind 2 attached wings. Nexari pursuit fractured for 37 seconds. In Oriel, 37 seconds was a lifetime measured in rescued civilians. Aboard the damaged Thalen tug Glass Current, Chief Pilot Renevshul clutched the control ring with all 4 hands, while human escort fire crossed in front of his viewport like steel rain. He had spent childhood drills memorizing evacuation routes by song because his people had expected extinction as a scheduling problem, not a possibility. Through the open channel, he heard Commander Sato on Kirov Line still counting actions by verified inputs, still sounding like a teacher at a storm-battered desk. Ren sent 1 burst transmission to Earth convoy control. "You are under attack in mind and metal both. Why are your crews still coherent?" The reply came from a human logistics lieutenant whose name Ren did not catch. "Coherent is generous. Functional is enough. Jump on beacon mark. We will hold your wake." Vran received casualty updates that did not match any opening model curve approved by High Command. Nexari losses remained lower in hull count but higher in strategic value. Relay cutters, synchronization ships, cognition amplifier tenders. Human losses remained visible and painful, yet corridor integrity persisted above collapse threshold. Every minute that civilians kept moving made Blake's stewardship narrative weaker across neutral feeds. He opened a secured line to Blake, overriding 1 level of protocol. The High Commander appeared against a backdrop of tactical projections and ceremonial banners, as if he had staged his bridge for history. "Sub-strategist," Blake said, tone dry. "Report." Vran kept his voice formal. "Humans are not resisting psychic suppression in the expected manner. They are executing through impairment using decentralized intent protocols and tactile discipline anchors. Fear induction degrades performance but fails to induce strategic disintegration. Recommend immediate doctrine revision and concentration on physical node destruction rather than cognition collapse assumptions." Blake's silver lines brightened with cold amusement. "You request doctrine revision during first engagement because prey twitched harder than predicted. Their command strain will accumulate. Their autonomous trees will fork into contradiction. Continue pressure." "Aye, Commander. Corridor data does not support attritional confidence. Their reinforcement tempo through Thalen Beacon Lattice exceeded all model bounds. If this continues for another cycle, you risk speaking panic into command channels," Blake cut in. "Remember your caste obligations. Humanity is neurologically blunt. Their temporary coordination is artifact, not paradigm. Break their logistics and the rest follows." The channel closed. Vran stared at his own reflection in darkened glass for half a breath and recognized the forbidden thought forming anyway. Perhaps Nixari doctrine had mistaken universal vulnerability for universal surrender. On Resolute Meridian, Hayes listened to real-time intercepts from Nixari internal bands that cryptanalysis could parse only in fragments. The fragments were enough. "They are arguing doctrine," he said quietly. Volkov's voice entered from the diplomatic relay compressed by distance and encryption, but unmistakably steady. She had remained within conquered legal channels while war unfolded, weaponizing procedure with the same discipline Hayes applied to fleet geometry. "Assembly observers are seeing Oriole feeds in full," she said. "Neutral block language has shifted from civil dispute to armed seizure. Keep your evidence chain clean. Every rescue and every strike is being archived for tribunal." "Understood," Hayes said. "Tell them this is still Phase 2. A pause. Then Volkov added, "Marcus, Thalen delegates are watching live from secure gallery. They are asking whether Lane 4 can hold." Hayes looked at the plot where Lane 4 glowed amber, 1 hit away from red. "Tell them Lane 4 holds because we decided it does." He cut the line and turned back to tactical. "Commit reserve corvettes from Screen Group Cobalt. No hero patterns. Rotate stressed crews where possible. Medical to cycle anti-panic injectors by protocol limits only. We do not trade long-term cognition health for short-term bravado." That, too, was capability. The humans were not machines. They were frightened professionals with procedures built for frightened professionals. Vran shifted his command spindle deeper into the engagement envelope to regain direct sensory confidence. The move exposed him to raw combat telemetry and, more dangerously, to unfiltered psychic feedback from cognition pilots straining against human resistance patterns. What came through the link was disorienting. Not blankness, not immunity, but crowded emotional weather held inside tight behavioral rails. Human minds under assault flooded with dread, anger, grief, and relentless task focus. Nixari training taught that such volume should fragment agency. Instead, it produced stubborn continuity. A junior cognition officer broke discipline first. "Sub-strategist, I cannot sort authentic command intent from their procedural recitation. They repeat checklists while feeling terror. The terror is real. The checklist is real. Which one controls action?" Vran answered before he had fully solved it himself. "The checklist." The officer swallowed, crest dimming. "Then our primary lever is no longer primary." Around him, Nixari command culture began to fracture along old caste seams that had been invisible during centuries of easy victories. Combat officers wanted heavier kinetic commitment and broader firing authority. Cognition Cast insisted one more calibrated wave would break human cohesion. Political overseers demanded optics management and immediate declarations of success to preserve external compliance. Each faction read the same numbers and arrived at mutually incompatible certainties. A civilian channel from Concord neutral monitors pierced the tactical noise with an official query. Confirm status of seized medical convoy personnel under humanitarian convention. Vran's aide prepared the standard deflection about protective reassignment. Vran stopped him. "Do not answer yet," he said. The aide stared. "Silence implies fault." "An inaccurate answer implies evidence of fault," Vran replied. "Delay." He knew exactly how that would be read in the assembly, and he made the choice anyway. Internal conflict was no longer theoretical. It sat in his throat like grit. At Oriel's center ring, the tide shifted another degree. Human escorts that had seemed scattered now revealed converging arcs around 3 Nexari command relays, forcing the oligarchy ships either to defend those nodes or continue pressing civilian lanes without synchronization support. Nexari doctrine had never needed to choose under this specific pressure because opponents normally collapsed before such choices mattered. Vran committed 2 heavy cutters to protect the relays and immediately lost pursuit continuity on Lane 2. He redirected strike wings to compensate and opened a gap near Lane 4 that Hayes exploited within seconds. "Lane 4 corridor expanded," Tactical announced on Resolute Meridian. "Thalen cluster crossing." Hayes permitted himself no smile. "Mark it. Keep moving." The crossing was not clean. One Thalen freighter burned through half its maneuver fuel-dodging debris. A human corvette took a glancing beam that killed port thrusters and sent it spinning until tug drones stabilized the hull. But the cluster crossed. Civilians passed through a corridor the Nexari had promised to own by now. Vran watched the transit markers blink beyond interdiction range and felt a new, unwelcome variable entering the battle. The galaxy was witnessing a failed forecast in real time. Blake had promised collapse. Oriel displayed adaptation. In oligarch politics, failed prophecy invited predation from within. He opened a restricted operations board and began drafting a regroup directive that stopped short of calling it withdrawal. All cognition wings reduce broad-spectrum fear architecture by 20% and reallocate to targeted confusion bursts on fire control decks only. Strike groups prioritize physical beacon interdiction over morale collapse. Relay tenders harden against rail lance harmonics and disperse spacing. We are transitioning to attritional containment posture. Sael looked up sharply. High Command did not authorize transition. Vran kept his eyes on the board. High Command will receive a battlefield that still exists to command. Across the formation, Nexari ships adjusted vectors, pulling inward to protect relay assets and rebalancing for a fight they had not planned to fight this early. It was not retreat. It was not victory. It was regrouping under pressure, and every Nexari officer in the spindle understood what that admission meant, even if none said it aloud. In the same moment, human sensor arrays logged the shift and flagged it for Hayes. He read the pattern, recognized doctrine bending in real time, and issued the next comm instruction into a bridge where everyone still felt fear and kept working anyway. Confirmed, he said. They are learning. Good. So are we. Hayes let the tactical sphere rotate one full cycle, then zoomed out until Oriel Junction shrank from a battlefield into a logistics map. The change looked almost absurd against burning hulls and crowded distress channels, yet it exposed the underlying geometry he needed. Nexari regroup vectors were tightening around relay assets exactly as Vran's emergency directive suggested they would, and that gave Earth a narrow opening to reveal the second capability They had kept masked under convoy defense posture. Operations, Hayes said. Execute treaty web depth pattern. I want all dormant nodes live in sequence, not in burst. Make them watch it unfold. Commander Renault turned, surprised despite years on his staff. Depth pattern in open engagement? In open engagement, Hayes confirmed. They still think the lattice is a refugee crutch. Let us correct that misunderstanding. Across 3 sectors, old agreements became immediate force multipliers. The Allen Beacon custodians activated archival jump harmonics that had been installed as redundancy after piracy famines 2 centuries earlier. Human modular carriers detached mission pods in pre-planned packets, each pod configured for one task only: munitions transfer, medevac intake, drone relay, shield patch deployment, or tug support. Merchant captains under emergency covenant clauses changed routes without waiting for market compensation guarantees because the treaty language had always prioritized survival corridors over profit during extinction risk events. None of it looked dramatic by itself. Together, it altered battle tempo faster than Nixari command doctrine could recalculate. 31 minutes into Phase 2, the first deep pattern consequence hit the field. A Nixari strike wing trapped the human corvette Aldercrest against debris shear near Lane 2 and began a textbook kill spiral. Aldercrest had lost aft maneuver control and could not outrun anything heavier than a cargo tug. Vran watched the trap close and tagged it for morale dissemination. Then 6 transponder pings appeared from opposite vectors, each carrying valid Thalan civilian identifiers and low-mass signatures consistent with relief craft. Nixari gunners hesitated for 2 seconds to avoid broadcasting a live massacre on neutral feeds. In those 2 seconds, the 6 signatures shed outer shells and became autonomous repair drones, and decoy emitters launched from Covenant-certified aid containers. Aldercrest regained partial thrust, rolled under cover of its own debris plume, and escaped the spiral with 23 hull breaches and a functioning reactor. Sale stared at the replay in silence before speaking. They weaponized humanitarian packaging. Vran's jaw tightened. They weaponized legal expectation. That is worse. On Concord Public Stream, commentators from neutral blocks began using a phrase that had not appeared in pre-war assessments: treaty warfare. The implication was destabilizing. Earth was not improvising under pressure. Earth had spent centuries building a legal, logistical, and moral architecture designed to function while being attacked. The Nixari had interpreted that patience as weakness because they measured power in immediate coercion. At Oriel, delayed preparation was suddenly visible as accumulated force. On Resolute Meridian, Hayes accepted 3 simultaneous requests and denied 2. No pursuit beyond Beacon Corridor, he told Cobalt Screen Command. No celebratory overextension. Hold the lanes and keep relay pressure constant. He switched to convoy control. Medical packets route through Node Tamarind, then Tamarind to Lane 4. Keep stress rotations moving. Nobody stays under direct pulse for more than 40 minutes if relief exists. A junior officer at Strategic Analysis looked up from a flood of incoming data. Admiral, treaty node confirmations are still coming in from systems outside declared engagement radius. Some of these communities are activating support without direct request. Hayes nodded, unsurprised. They read the covenant as written. The officer swallowed and kept reading. The scholars of Lum have opened archival navigation wells to civilian traffic. Merchants of Pax are providing fuel credits with deferred settlement. Kith aviary flotillas are forwarding life support membranes and calling them historical debt service. For the first time that day, Renault allowed a thin, grim smile. Blake mocked sentimental paperwork. Hayes watched a Thalan transport clear lane 4 by 12 seconds under fire from 2 Nexari cutters, now blind in one sensor band. Sentiment, he said, is what people call obligation when they never intended to honor any. At the Nixari spindle, political overseers demanded a counter-narrative packet within minutes. Vran sent the numbers instead of rhetoric. Civilian corridor retention remained above collapse threshold. Human reinforcement arrival variance had fallen below 6%, despite active psychic interference. Nixari relay attrition was now compounding command lag. He added a recommendation for immediate interdiction against all identified treaty web nodes, then paused before sending. That action would require strikes on platforms marked as neutral aid infrastructure by Concord Registry, and once transmitted, the order could not be politically disguised. He sent it anyway. Blake's response arrived as a direct cognition pulse, clipped and cold. Approved with discretion. If neutral registries conceal hostile logistics, neutrality has already failed. Vran accepted the authorization and felt the room around him grow colder than any climate setting. The Nixari had just crossed from coercive stewardship theater into open war against the legal substrate of interspecies refuge. Tactical necessity could explain it. History would not forgive it. 48 minutes after the treaty web depth pattern activated, the balance shifted from contested endurance toward human initiative. Human carriers were no longer only reinforcing convoys. They were cycling exhausted crews out and fresh crews in through beacon microhops so quickly that Nixari cognition pilots could not sustain personalized fear profiles on specific bridges. Rail lance batteries that had fired raggedly in the opening exchange settled into disciplined cadence. Thalon beacon operators began feeding predictive drift data directly into human gunnery solutions, converting civilian navigation expertise into combat survivability without ever putting a Thalon ship in attack posture. Wren of Shoal, still at glass current, listened to the merged channel, where human and Thalon controllers spoke with different cadences and identical intent. Beacon 9 drift correction uploaded, he called. Debris lane opening in 6 heartbeats. A human gunnery chief answered immediately, voice raw with fatigue and concentration. Received. Buying you those 6. The shot that followed clipped a Nixari cutter's sensor crown and forced it to break lock on a refugee cluster. Wren felt his neck membranes flush dark, then pale again. Not from fear alone now, but from a sensation his grandparents had described and he had never believed he would feel in open space. Guarded continuity. By the second hour of fighting at Oriel, Volkov had not left the Concord legal relay chamber once. She stood behind a transparent evidence wall where every strike, seizure, rescue, and transmission was tagged by time and treaty clause. Around her, neutral legal clerks worked through overload with stunned professionalism. She watched Nixari authorization signatures appear on attacks against registered aid nodes and understood that the war's moral center had hardened beyond debate. Novak entered on secure hollow from assembly sublevel command, helmet now on, expression controlled. Ambassador, Nixari security auxiliaries are trying to quarantine Thalon delegates under emergency cognition protection rules. They have not breached our perimeter yet. Do they have assembly warrant? They have invented one. Volkov's gaze did not waver. Transmit full challenge to chamber clerk and public archive, then read this into local feed. Any attempt to seize protected delegates inside conquered territory will be treated as an extension of active aggression already in progress. Novak's mouth flattened in professional approval. Understood. We will remain very procedural. When the channel closed, Volkov opened a line to Hayes that both knew would be recorded and replayed by history. Marcus, they are striking aid infrastructure and attempting legal kidnappings in the same hour. The pretense is gone. Hayes answered over distant weapons telemetry and human breath discipline counting under stress. Then we stopped treating this as an argument they might yet win on technicality. He shifted to fleet-wide command broadcast and spoke with the same calm that had unnerved Blake in the chamber, but now it carried steel all the way through. All human and Covenant-aligned units. Nexari Command has authorized interdiction on protected aid nodes. This is your confirmation that their objective is civilian leverage, not corridor stability. We hold every evacuation lane. We recover every abducted crew we can reach. We disable every relay that supports coercive seizure. Maintain rule set Aster. We are not here for vengeance. We are here because these lanes contain people who trusted our word. The broadcast moved through hulls where officers were shaking, sweating, and still following procedure. Human resolve was not theatrical courage. It was contractual loyalty under pressure, repeated across command decks, engine bays, infirmaries, and tug cockpits by people who had accepted fear as a condition rather than a verdict. Aboard Kirov Line, Commander Sato heard Hayes' message while medics strapped her communications officer into a recovery chair after pulse-induced disorientation. She keyed ship-wide channel. You heard, Joint. We do this for lanes and lives. Helm. Keep branch Delta ladder active. Weapons prioritize relay mass over hull kills. Engineering, report what breaks before it breaks. A voice from aft damage control came back hoarse and steady. We are holding by tape, prayer, and 2 very annoyed technicians. Sato allowed the smallest shard of sardonic relief. Annoyed technicians built civilization. Continue. On the Nexari side, fear changed flavor. Early confidence had been predatory and expansive. Now it was managerial, brittle, and increasingly directed inward. Cognition pilots complained of contaminated read space as human decoys, procedural recitations, and genuine panic signals blended into operational fog. Combat officers resented political constraints on indiscriminate fire while cameras watched. Political overseers demanded victory language unsupported by telemetry. Vran spent 15 continuous minutes suppressing mutiny by memorandum, then watched a relay tender detonate after a human spinal round found the harmonic weakness Sile had warned about. Sile spoke without looking up. If they keep stripping relays at this rate, command desynchronization crosses irreversible threshold in 26 minutes. Vran responded with formal precision that barely concealed the strain. Then, we force decisive engagement before threshold. Signal all heavy carriers. Converge on central ring, and prepare annihilation wedge. We break their forward armada in one blow, or we lose narrative and control together. The order was not Blake's preferred script, but it was the only move left that could still produce visible dominance quickly enough to matter. Hayes saw the Nexari heavies begin that inward turn and recognized the turning point as it formed. There, he said, pointing at converging vectors around Oriel's central ring. They are abandoning distributed pressure for concentration kill. They want one spectacle. Renault's hands hovered over his board. Do we refuse the center? We shape it, Hayes said. Push gravitic curtains from mines 3 through 7. Feed them the corridor they think they chose. He opened a restricted channel to selected task group commanders. This is joint actual. Initiate silent choir partial release. Repeat, partial. I want decoy biosignatures at 30% density and timing noise swarms across cognition bands. Do not reveal full architecture yet. Make them doubt what they are reading. Acknowledgements came back from ships that had waited years to use the protocol in war. Drone pods launched from human and treaty-aligned hulls, scattering clouds of micro-emitters that generated plausible command mind echoes and false stress signatures tuned to Nexari expectation models. To telepathic readers, the battlefield became crowded with convincing ghosts, carrying rank patterns, fear profiles, and intention gradients that looked actionable and led nowhere. Real strike groups moved in the seams between those phantoms, cutting relay escorts and beacon hunters with abrupt, disciplined violence. Vran's tactical sphere went feral. Target icons multiplied faster than verification algorithms could call them. 3 apparent human command clusters appeared near Lane 1, drew Nexari interceptors, and dissolved into drone noise. A high-confidence signature matching Hayes' command profile flashed near debris shelf Gamma. 2 destroyers burned hard toward it and found an empty thermal wake. Meanwhile, real human corvettes punched through a blind arc and disabled a cognition amplifier tender at close range. Sale's voice cracked for the first time. "We are reading minds that are not there." Vran answered through clenched discipline. "No. We are reading what they want read." The center of Oriel now belonged to whichever side could impose interpretation faster than confusion spread. For the first time in Nexari military memory, telepathic superiority had become a liability under engineered cognitive clutter. That realization moved through Nexari crews with the cold speed of institutional panic. On Concord Feed, neutral analysts stopped speaking in hypotheticals. The phrase human advantage entered official commentary in 6 languages. Hayes watched Nexari formation integrity fray by measurable increments and gave the order that converted opportunity into control. All groups execute hinge maneuver Echo Spear. Keep civilians behind curtain. Strip shield harmonics, then hit relays in sequence. Do not drift into kill hunger. We are preparing the field for the confrontation they insisted on. Outside, gravitic mines unfolded invisible pressure wells that bent Nexari approach vectors into narrower channels. Rail lance salvos struck those channels with methodical brutality, not to annihilate every hull, but to shear cohesion from the wedge before it could close. Fallon beacons pulsed in counterpoint, opening and closing microlanes that let human reserves appear where Nexari models predicted delay. 97 minutes after the first seizure alarm, Oriel no longer looked like a Nexari demonstration operation with a human resistance at the edges. It looked like a controlled dismantling of Nexari tempo by a species that had studied fear, law, and logistics as one discipline. Hayes keyed a final message to Volkov while alarms and confirmations braided around him. Oriel will hold, but Blake will not stop at Oriel now that he has lost the script. He will mass for a punitive, decisive engagement where cameras can see it. Volkov answered at once, as if she had already reached the same conclusion. Kaled Gate. Kaled Gate, Hayes confirmed. He returned to command net and spoke to a fleet that had earned the right to hear plain truth. You have shifted the balance. You have held the lanes. You have shown them what our treaties mean when tested. Expect escalation to core fleet confrontation. We will meet it on ground of our choosing. Across Oriel, human ships adjusted formation from emergency defense into deliberate pursuit geometry while keeping refugee corridors shielded behind layered screens. Nexari heavies withdrew just far enough to regroup, battered and angry, their command links flickering under accumulated disruption. Between the 2 formations, wreckage drifted through beacon light like fractured constellations, and every officer on both sides understood that the next battle would decide more than a junction. The confrontation was coming, and this time, humanity would arrive ready to end it. The confrontation arrived exactly where Volkov and Hayes had named it. With Oriel's lanes only just transitioning from shaped defense into sustained escort control, Kaled Gate was already filling with mass signatures so dense that tactical overlays began dropping labels to preserve processor speed. The gate was an old hyperlane throat wrapped around a dead dwarf star, ringed by abandoned anchor platforms and gravity scars from wars No one still taught in officer school. Blake chose it for theater and punishment. If he shattered Earth's forward armada there, every refugee route behind Oriel would fold from panic and math. He transmitted first, naturally. His image rose over open bands to every fleet and every Concord observer stream, silver neural lines pulsing with controlled fury. "Witness the correction," Blake said. "At Oriel, we tolerated interference while preserving civilian throughput and legal dignity. At Kaled Gate, tolerance ends. Humanity has mistaken temporary survival for parity. Their mute captains will now learn what happens when cognition empires cease restraint. Thalon corridors are punishment territory. Any vessel carrying Covenant marks will be seized. Any escort will be broken. Let the galaxy remember that thought governs matter, and those who cannot read minds were never fit to shape history." He cut the feed before replies could dilute his performance. On Resolute Meridian, Hayes watched the Nexari core fleets settle into annihilation wedge geometry and felt no need to match rhetoric. "All groups, we expected this exact move. Execute gate lattice plan. Kill boxes 1 through 6. Sequential activation. Keep civilian lanes out of engagement cone. We end their command coherence, not our standards." Around him, bridge officers moved with quiet urgency, while pulse warning indicators strobed amber. Cognitive hardening teams pushed final protocol reminders across shipboard channels. Verify inputs, trust procedures, name reality before action. No one looked fearless. That had never been the requirement. At Hayes's signal, dormant gravitic mines deployed from disguised cargo shells and anchor platform cavities, not as explosions, but as pressure curtains. Space itself thickened along selected vectors. Nexari heavy carriers entering those bands bled velocity at the wrong moments and drifted into narrower corridors than their pilots intended. Human rail lance batteries had been waiting for exactly that compression. "Strip harmonics," Renault ordered. The first salvo hit like disciplined thunder. Not glamorous, not cinematic, just mercilessly accurate. Shield harmonics on 2 Nexari capitals collapsed out of phase, exposing armor seams to follow on spinal kinetics from strike wings that had approached dark on emission control. One carrier lost dorsal command vanes. Another suffered relay crown failure and dropped from synchronization net, still armed and suddenly half blind. Blake answered with psychic saturation so intense it rippled through even hardened crews. On Kirov Line, Commander Sato's vision narrowed to a tunnel, while old grief images flashed uninvited behind her eyes. She tasted copper, heard her own pulse, and kept her voice level. "Verified input. Tactical plot green. Verified input. Helm response nominal. Continue delta ladder. Fire by timer." Her gunnery officer whispered a checklist through clenched teeth and loosed 3 lances that cored a Nexari amplifier frigate. The ship spun, burning out of formation. Sato did not celebrate. Next target. Kelvran, now commanding what remained of the Oriel spindle under direct attachment to core fleet, watched his tactical board degrade into contradiction. Human drone choirs had expanded from partial release to full architecture. Silent choir was no longer a rumor. It was a battlefield climate. Thousands of decoy biosignatures bloomed in layered timing noise, each carrying plausible rank signatures and emotional gradients tuned to Nexari cognitive expectations. Telepaths reached into the fog and came back with confidence about enemies that vanished when fired upon. "We are drowning in curated false minds," Sal said, voice thin with strain. "Every certainty is expensive." Vran made the only choice left to professionals in collapsing doctrine. Cut broad-spectrum reads, narrow to physics, track heat, mass, vector. Let the telepaths support, not lead. Across Nixari command bands, caste outrage erupted, then died as ships kept exploding when they trusted pure cognition precedents. Hayes saw the adjustment and shifted immediately. They are trying to re-anchor on physical telemetry. Good. Flood them with timing noise swarms and drift mass decoys. Strike Group Fenrir, take the western seam now. Fenrir's corvettes slashed through a blind gap and severed 2 relay tenders in 90 seconds. At Keelid Gate scale, 90 seconds was strategic amputation. Nixari wing commanders started receiving orders late, then receiving contradictory updates from nodes already dead. Blake opened a private command channel to all surviving Nixari flagships. No performance cadence left. Converge on Earth's central mass and ram if needed. Restore primacy by destruction. That order killed what remained of his formation discipline. Ships surged in anger rather than geometry. Human kill boxes closed around them. From the Concord legal relay chamber, Volkov watched the battle feed split-screened with treaty clauses and casualty logs. Neutral delegates had stopped pretending this was an internal stewardship dispute. Even the blocks that disliked Earth's stubborn legalism were now recording Nixari command traffic for tribunal use. Volkov requested emergency speaking authority and was granted in under 10 seconds. Her voice entered fleet-wide channels and the assembly streamed together, steady as cold iron. For 3 centuries, humanity and the Thalen honored a covenant most of you called naive. We honored it when we were poor. We honored it when honoring it cost us grain, escorts, and political capital we could not spare. We honored it because extinction is not a policy variable. It is a line. Today, that line was crossed again by those who believed power grants ownership of the vulnerable. We offered notice, arbitration, and restraint. We were answered with abduction, seizure, and war against aid corridors. Let the record show this clearly. Earth's objective is not species punishment. Our objective is to end coercive capacity, recover the taken, and secure the lanes permanently. To Nixari crews still receiving lawful orders from a broken command caste, power down and transmit surrender beacons. To those continuing attacks on civilian routes, understand this is the last warning you will ever receive from us. The channel closed. In Kaled space, dozens of smaller Nixari ships hesitated, then peeled away from Blake's convergence order and lit surrender codes. Human fire control ignored them and stayed on active threats. The distinction spread faster than propaganda. Then, the core broke. At minute 19 of full engagement, 3 Nixari capital carriers lost synchronization within the same 30-second window when Rail-Lance strikes stripped harmonics and drone choirs, spiked psychic bandwidth into unusable static. Human strike wings hit pre-computed vector angles built around telepathic anticipation bias coming from trajectories Nixari pilots kept underweighting because cognition doctrine taught different threat priorities. Spinal kinetic rounds punched through command spines. One carrier vented atmosphere in a white plume and went dark. Another rolled, powerless. The third tried to fold and failed. Core wedge has collapsed, Renault said, barely above conversation level. Hayes looked at the plot, then gave the order that made defeat total. All groups, transition to disarmament fire. No punitive kills. Disable drives, weapons, relays. Capture command vessels. Locate Sovereign Clarity. They found it clawing for escape at the edge of the gate. Blake's flagship, Sovereign Clarity, was larger than any hull he had risked at Oriel, a black spear wrapped in cognition amplifiers and ceremonial armor plating. Under normal conditions, it could have folded through emergency lanes before boarding elements came within 10,000 kilometers. Hayes had seeded interdiction buoys through the likely vectors while the main battle still raged. Buoys active, sensors said. A ring of invisible constraints tightened around the emergency fold lane. Sovereign Clarity initiated jump anyway, its drive spine sheared against compressed geometry with a flash that tore half its aft emitters loose and dumped the whole ship into uncontrolled drift above Keeled Gate. On Blake's bridge, lights died and returned in sickly red. Telepathic chatter became static in pain. He tasted blood where he had bitten his own tongue and forced himself upright. "Restore fold," an engineer answered with shaking formality. "Drive architecture is fractured beyond immediate recovery. Interdiction field persists. Weapons at 30%. Boarding alarms active port side." Blake straightened his crown circuit as if posture could reverse physics. "Repel them." The first breach charge went off 2 decks below. Captain Sofia Novak led the entry stack through smoke and flickering gravity with the same procedural calm she had carried in conquered corridors. Her armor's neural dampers hummed against residual psychic spikes bleeding through bulkheads. Behind her, Marines moved in practiced arcs, less like raiders than technicians solving a violent systems problem. Nixari defenders fired from recessed nodes, then faltered when dampers flattened their projection advantage. The firefight was sharp and brief. Novak's teams advanced by compartment, locking survivors in restraint fields and marking medevac priorities as they went. "Bridge access in 12, her sergeant said. "Keep recording," Novak replied. "Chain of custody from first contact." They cut through the bridge bulkhead with thermal saws. Metal screamed. Pressure equalized. Smoke rolled aside. Blake stood at the center dais amid dead consuls and fallen officers, one hand braced on a cracked command rail, eyes bright with exhausted fury. 2 surviving guards tried to raise sidearms and were dropped by stun bursts before they fired. Novak stepped through the breach, weapon steady, visor up so there would be no argument about identity. "Hi, Commander Blake," she said. "By Concord emergency mandate and human wartime authority under active treaty defense, you are under arrest for command responsibility in mass abduction, civilian coercion, and armed aggression against protected corridors. Order your crew to stand down." He laughed once, ragged and contemptuous. "Arrest requires parity. You are animals with tools. You cannot cage a superior mind." Novak held his gaze. "Watch us." Blake's neural lines flared. He tried one last coercive push, a concentrated spear of panic aimed at Novak's motor cortex. Her wrist haptic pulsed. She named one verified input in her head, felt her training lock in, and fired a calibrated neural disruptor burst that dropped him to one knee without permanent injury. Marines moved instantly, securing his arms in full restraints while a medic attached cognition null clamps at neck and temples. "Target contained," Novak said on open record channel. "Repeat. Blake contained and alive." On nearby Nixari frequencies, the transmission landed like a structural failure. 3 remaining warships powered down within 2 minutes. 2 attempted flight and were disabled by precision shots to drive cones. The battle ended, not with annihilation, but with command extinction. Hayes boarded Sovereign Clarity only after engineering teams declared it stable enough not to kill everyone aboard. He found Novak overseeing prisoner transfer in a shattered hangar lit by emergency strips. Blake stood inside a portable cognition null field cage, breathing hard, posture still trying for Imperial. Hayes stopped in front of him, hands behind his back. "For 312 years, Hayes said, voice quiet enough that Blake had to lean forward to hear. "We were patient. We hoped your government would choose law over hunger and status over cruelty. At every step, we gave notice. At every step, you chose escalation. You mistook restraint for fear and memory for sentiment. You chose poorly." Blake stared at him through the field shimmer. "Kill me then. Make a martyr and prove your species is exactly what we said." Hayes shook his head. "No. You are going to trial." Novak signaled the transfer team. The cage locked onto mag rails and moved toward the shuttle bay. Outside the damaged hull, Kaled Gate was full of drifting wreckage, surrender beacons, rescue craft, and human escorts already guiding medevac corridors through what had been, an hour earlier, the Nexari claim to inevitability. As Blake was loaded into a sealed transport chamber lined with cognition null mesh, he tried to speak a final command into open channel. The chamber's silence field engaged and took his voice away before the first full sentence formed. The transport bearing Blake cleared Sovereign Clarity under armed escort, and the first order Hayes gave afterward was not about pursuit. "Open channel to all task groups," he said. "Cease offensive fires against powered-down Nexari hulls. Prioritize fires and decompression control. Any ship transmitting surrender or medical code is protected under Aster rules effective now." Renault looked up from a board still full of red markers. "Admiral, we have legal grounds for punitive strikes on their core shipyard net. Their carriers targeted hospital lanes." "We have grounds," Hayes said. "We are not using them." By dawn cycle at Kaled Gate, wreckage lanes had become rescue lanes. Human cutters latched onto disabled Nexari cruisers and pushed atmosphere stabilizers through ragged breaches. Thalen relief tugs, still carrying Covenant markings Blake had called punishment flags, ferried medkits and pressure membranes to enemy civilian crews trapped on support barges. The message was unmistakable to every observer stream. Command cast accountable. Populations protected. Captain Novak supervised prisoner transfer in Hangar 3 of Resolute Meridian, while medics triaged both uniforms without asking which side they had served first. A Nexari tactical officer with shrapnel burns recoiled when a human corpsman approached, expecting restraint shocks or staged humiliation. The corpsman set down an injector tray, raised both gloved hands in plain view, and spoke through translation audio. "This treats pain and prevents neural swelling. You can refuse. If you accept, I will tell you each step before I do it." The officer stared, then gave one stiff nod. Nearby, 2 recovered human convoy pilots sat wrapped in thermal blankets, faces gray with fatigue but alive. They had been among the 6 abducted crews Hayes and Volkov had tracked in fragments before Oriel. The other 4 came in by staggered shuttle through the morning, extracted from relay holds when Nexari surrender codes unlocked custody decks. One missing envoy from Volkov's empty assembly chairs stepped off a medevac litter under her own power, saluted Novak with a shaking hand, and asked for the treaty roll before asking for food. Novak blinked once, then passed her a tablet. "Read after fluids. That is an order." 3 days after Kaled Gate, Volkov stood again on the central platform in the same assembly chamber where Blake had projected human fear for applause. This time, no one stood laughing. Evidence drones floated low over sealed exhibit columns, seizure logs from Iskar Bend, relay orders authorizing attacks on registered aid nodes, body cam footage from Sovereign Clarity, and the archived emotional extraction projection Blake had used as spectacle. Concord legal staff authenticated each file in sequence. The chain of custody Novak had insisted on at the breach was admitted without challenge. Siren of Low Tide watched from the Thalen dais, membranes pale with controlled emotion instead of panic-darkened fear. When the clerk invited public terms for cease authority, Volkov did not rush the words. "The Nexari War Command has been dismantled in the field," she said. "Earth requests enforcement, not extermination. We submit the Aster terms for ratification. Full military disarmament under Concord monitors, abolition of psychic caste ownership in civil law, release and repatriation of all abducted persons, constitutional transition to elected civilian councils, and protected food and medical corridors for Nexari populations regardless of prior allegiance." A delegate from a neutral bloc leaned forward. "Ambassador, Why no sterilization strikes on shipyard cores? Your own analysts filed that option. Volkov held his gaze. Because we are ending a coercive system, not auditioning to replace it. Justice without restraint is only revenge with better grammar. The vote passed with only 2 abstentions. In the week that followed, Hayes toured Habitat Ring 19 and Ring 22, where oligarch sabotage had collapsed life support when command crews fled. Human engineers in scorched worksuits crawled through coolant trunks beside Nexari civilian technicians who had never before worked without caste clearance. Thalon relief ships queued in disciplined arcs, offloading nutrient gel and pediatric respirators under Earth escort. A Nexari parent carrying a child with oxygen fins stopped in front of a human mechanic blackened by sealant foam, hesitated, then bowed in the old military style their empire had reserved for superiors. The mechanic looked embarrassed and pointed toward the reopened clinic. "Go, air is stable in there." Not everyone accepted mercy with grace. Several Nexari hardline captains refused disarmament inspections and were boarded, restrained, and transferred without ceremony. No summary executions followed. No prison ships vanished. Every detainee was logged, medically screened, and represented at tribunal intake. At the Conquered War Tribunal, Blake entered in a sealed cognition null chamber, crown circuit removed, wrists bound in field restraints that hummed against his skin. Vran testified under oath about command directives to strike treaty web nodes and confirmed Blake's direct approvals. Sayal authenticated tactical records showing fabricated stewardship claims while civilian seizures were ongoing. The avian delegate who had asked, by what legal standard, sat in the front gallery for all 12 days and did not miss a session. When the judgment came, the presiding arbiter read each charge in full. Mass abduction, civilian coercion, treaty aggression, command authorization of attacks on protected aid infrastructure. Conviction was unanimous. Sentence was permanent imprisonment at Black Vault Station under cognition null confinement, alive and legally visible as precedent. Blake requested a final statement. The tribunal allowed it. "You have chained a higher order of mind to comfort lesser species," he began, voice sharp with old contempt. "History will..." He pushed a coercive pulse at the bench out of habit or desperation. The cell's automatic silence field triggered instantly and swallowed the rest of his sentence. 2 wardens guided him out while the recorder logged, in dry legal language, that the defendant had been muted by his own violation. 5 years later, rain tapped the skylight of Earth's first treaty hall in Reykjavik, now restored and expanded, but still keeping one section of original stone where the heater had once failed during the covenant signing. Children moved through the gallery in bright study sashes while instructors pointed out artifact cases. The first Thalen algae patent exchange, pirate war escort manifests, evacuation charts annotated by hand, and Volkov's small silver treaty pin, now mounted in climate glass with her note beneath it. Worn inside left sleeve for 21 years. Returned to the archive on ratification of the Continuity Accords. The Accords had grown from one old covenant into a standing anti-extinction framework with enforceable asylum corridors for minor species, once treated as expendable buffer populations. Concord Patrol doctrine now required mixed species oversight on refugee lanes. No polity could claim stewardship and hide seizures behind private law again without triggering automatic intervention protocols. Hayes had retired from field command and taught strategic ethics at Fleet College, where his first lecture always began with Oriel telemetry and ended with a maintenance checklist from Kirov Line. Sado headed cognitive hardening development for convoy forces, insisting that every simulation include fear metrics and post-action recovery budgets. because surviving the battle and surviving yourself were different tasks. Novak directed Tribunal Security Operations, the branch that trained officers to preserve evidence under fire and keep prisoners alive long enough to answer in court. None of them became monuments. They became institutions. The Nexari oligarchy no longer existed. Civilian councils governed under Concord supervision. Psychic ability retained cultural value but lost legal privilege. No citizen could own, rank, or silence another through cognition law. Ring 22. Once days from atmospheric failure hosted an open election broadcast carried by the same network that had streamed Blake's threats at Kaled Gate. Vran, barred from command for life but spared imprisonment after full cooperation, served on a Reconstruction Advisory Board and signed his reports with no caste mark. Sale taught signal ethics and wrote a paper titled Limits of Mind-Centric Doctrine that became mandatory reading in 3 academies. In the Reykjavik Hall, Siren of Low Tide stood beside a class of Thalen hatchlings as they faced the old signing table. Their neck membranes flashed curiosity patterns, not evacuation stress. One hatchling raised a hand fin and asked the guide why the hall displayed route maps with red hazard lines if the war was over. Siren answered before the guide could. Because memory is part of safety. We study the lines so no one redraws them over people again. Volkov, hair now silver at the temples, watched from the back with a cup of cooling tea. She no longer carried the pin. She no longer needed to. Through the skylight, pale daylight spread across stone, glass, and small faces, learning history as inheritance instead of warning. Outside, no sirens sounded. No convoy alarms cut the air. The oldest treaty in known space had become the foundation of a wider peace, and the children under that open sky were memorizing names, not escape routes.